So Todd, thank you again for being a guest on Psyche podcast. I'm really
I always
excited.
love being here. Sorry, I interrupted you. Sorry.
No, man, no worries. Yeah, no, I'm excited that you're excited, and I'm really looking forward to discussing this. I guess this new chapter that you wrote that came out in a book that you and Julie, I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Is it Reshe?
Reshe, I think. Yeah.
Okay, it's interesting. I actually brought you up in a session the other day. This one college student who's into philosophy was kind of tripping over his words, not sure how to pronounce Lacan, and he's like, "I'm not sure how to say that." And I said, "Well, I've learned from someone that pronunciation is probably a fetish, so don't worry about it."
Yeah, I say that all the time. That is true. Yeah.
Well,
No, but
go
it's
ahead.
really her book. It's her
Okay,
book. I'm just kind of on as a person to help it get published. So,
well, that's
so
incredible.
I didn't really do anything.
And I'm hoping to actually have her on the podcast discuss her amazing chapter. She introduced me to Sabina Spielrein, so I'm
Yeah, Sabina Spielrein's amazing. She's
yeah,
especially when she's played by Keira Knightley. Do you know
dude.
this movie?
We just watched it a couple days
Yeah,
ago. Do you have any
yeah.
thoughts on it?
Oh, I love A Dangerous Method because I
I
think
thought it was amazing.
what, yeah, it's a great film. But what's interesting, I think, is that it's clear Cronenberg wants to like Jung more than Freud from the structure of the film,
No
and then
question.
but then the way it plays out, Freud becomes more sympathetic. So I thought that was it. I like the way that there's something in their relationship I mean, it's harder because Jung has a romantic tie with it. So from our perspective today, it seems like he's behaving very unethically, and Freud absolutely avoided that. But I think even beyond that, I think you see that Freud's right in a way that Jung isn't, even though Cronenberg seems to like Jung more. So I like that about the film. Uh, yeah, and I think Knightley's performance as Sabina Spielrein. I mean, the way that it begins, I think the film begins with her screaming
Yes,
in agony,
absolutely.
and yeah, and then she ends up being a great thinker in her own right, as Julie points out. Yeah,
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm actually reading this book by a scholar, Angela Sells, who wrote a book on her called The Woman and the Myth. And she had some really interesting things to say about Sabina and how she has been kind of overshadowed by Jung and even Freud, and she was her
yeah,
own thinker. And so it's important to kind of think about her as an autonomous person.
yeah. And her essay, where it's I think 1912, where she develops the first idea of death drive, is really
Yeah.
good. So it's amazing. And
So
Freud cites it in Beyond the Pleasure Principle,
no,
but
yeah, he does, right? But,
yeah,
but
yeah.
my, a question that maybe I can ask you about that before we get into your chapter is, so I know he quotes it in Beyond the Pressure Principle, but would he have had a different take than maybe she does, or does he end up kind of
I,
distancing himself from her? Do you know?
yeah, I think so because I think she has this idea that all creation is destruction. So for
Mm,
her, there's a link between destruction and creation, which I think is right. And Freud, remember, he constantly is he's it's the I think one of the weaknesses of his thought that he's separate. It's funny because I don't think he really thinks this, but he resorts to it all the time where
is
he
the
talks
Eros
about
and Thanatos?
exactly Eros, and he actually never used the term Thanatos. He talks
Oh,
about
okay.
death drive. But Eros and death drive, exactly. And I think that's she doesn't do that. And so I think there's something a little more and all I mean that she's right on that there's a tie between destruction and creation, but her emphasis actually in that essay is much more on creation, whereas I think why Freud doesn't say I'm just regurgitating what Sabina Spielrein says is because his emphasis is really on destruction in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And so I think it's a little different. And she's trying to explain, and in fact, creation is even in the title of her essay.
Sure.
So I think I don't know if this is right, but maybe she's a little more sanguine about death drive than Freud is. And
Okay.
Freud thinks it's the thing that gets in the way of all attempts to make a harmonious society. I don't think she thinks that. So
Okay. Okay.
I think that is a difference. I mean,
Sure.
Julie would be the better authority on this than me
Yeah,
to
I
talk
can't
about.
wait to talk to her about it.
Yeah.
So, okay, maybe a few quick questions about a
Sure.
dangerous method before we get into it. So, how did you
Yeah.
think they portrayed Freud? Do you remember that conversation where it's Freud and Jung, and Jung says, he sensed within himself that the radiator or whatever was going to make the noise, and Freud is just so dogmatic on his perspective. Do you think they gave
Yeah.
him a fair shot, or
Well, that's why was talking like it seems like it that Cronenberg is on the side of
okay,
Jung,
got you.
right? Because I think he's just portrayed more sympathetically, and Freud is depicted as a dogmatist, which
That's what it
okay,
is, a
me,
dogmatist. Yeah,
yeah, we're okay, maybe, but most dogmatists I know don't change their mind radically several times during their lifetime. So I find it a little bit unfair. And the other thing is, I think the film doesn't really go far enough on this, is that Jung was basically a Nazi. So when Nazism came to power, he was very he wasn't chagrined about that at all. So I think that's a that doesn't that gets pushed. I don't think that's emphasized by the film really at all. And the danger, because I think Cronenberg basically shares this view, not Nazism, but the idea that there are these I don't know, cosmic yin and yang forces that are mythological, that are constantly fighting within us, struggling within us, and we have to
got you.
reconcile ourselves to them. I mean, that seems to me the basic Jungian
Yeah,
take.
so yeah, for sure.
And like similarly, and because of that, he recoiled from Freud's emphasis on libido, and that I think is captured in the film. And I think Cronenberg also shares that Freud went a little overboard on libido, and I think that's what's one of the things that's great about Freud, contra Jung. So I feel like, yeah, the film is unfair, but what I like about it is the way that it kind of it against itself, it privileges Freud. So
Yeah. Okay. The other question was, did you catch
yeah,
whenever they're on their trip to America, and Jung
yeah,
was like, my wife, got me like a first class seat. I didn't know that she was extremely wealthy.
yeah,
That's a part
yeah.
of Jung's story, was he had this insane wealth from his wife's side, and then it just got me
Right.
thinking. I guess Freud didn't really come from those means.
Right, not at all.
Not at
Not at
all,
all.
right? So
Right, right. Like he couldn't even Freud Freud couldn't even get married. Right, he didn't have enough money to initially get married, so he was not a wealthy person, and so he was a little more. And this, a lot of people attack him for this, that he was a little more parsimonious than Jung, but it's because I think, because he came from less, and so yeah, so it's interesting. Yeah, but that is I, I think they also include the line, they don't know we're bringing them the plague, that Freud says
yes,
to
they
you.
do.
Yeah,
They
yeah,
do.
it's a
And
great
then the
line.
scene ends. Yeah, it's a great line.
Yeah, it's a great line. It's a great
I
line.
just love that.
But Jung is the only source for that. So we don't.
That's interesting.
Maybe it wasn't said, right? I mean, I of course I believe him, and I hope that it's true. But
Yeah.
Jung is the only source we have for that. And so
Oh, that's
yeah,
amazing.
yeah,
Man, that could be a whole nother conversation, but just their whole relationship and how it kind of broke, to me, is just fascinating. And it really did have a huge impact on Jung. I mean, it possibly sent
absolutely.
him into a psychosis, and
Right, I
so
know,
part of what led to the
and it,
Red Book. And
right, no, absolutely true. And I think it's a pattern with Freud. I think that
right.
he would have these really close bonds with men. The same pattern doesn't repeat with women. He didn't have a break with Sabina Spielrein. He didn't have a break with who was the other woman name? I think her name is Marguerite Hilferding. She was
Okay.
Margarita. She was the interesting. It was very interesting. She was the spouse of this famous Marxist. He wrote this book called Finance Capital, Rudolf Hilferding, and she was a really prominent psychoanalyst, I think, in Vienna among Freud's initial circle. I think that's right. And but he never had a break with women. The women that he was, and for instance, also I'm forgetting her name, but the woman that was tied to Lou Andrea Salome, that who's
Salome,
tied to
yeah.
Nietzsche, right? Like, again, no break at all, just very tight relations.
So how
So
do you make sense of that? Like the difference in the gender and how he would not break with females versus males is
yeah, I
fascinating.
think that I don't know. It's either the men felt a rivalry with him,
Mhm.
or the other way around. He felt a rivalry with them, and he didn't want someone to challenge him. Although I don't, I think he didn't. I think he was. Maybe it's just contingent that the women didn't. This wasn't true of them, but Spielrein had doctrinal disputes with him, and that didn't seem to matter. But he he wasn't very tolerant of doctrinal dis. He didn't think it was a psychoanalysis was a big tent that could incorporate a lot of different perspectives. So he thought if you went too far, like he thought that Jung went too far into mysticism.
Totally.
He thought that other thinkers went too far into free sexuality. He
Yeah.
would break with them. So
I forget
I
what his
think
break
that,
with Adler was about, but I know
well,
even
Adler was about this idea. So Adler's main idea was this notion of masculine protest,
okay.
and that he thought, and so basic. I almost think this is kind of a crazy idea, but I almost think that every book that Freud had for male figures was about power, that they were
Mm,
trying to think about the psyche in terms of power, and Freud always wanted to come back to libido or some that emphasis. And so if you try to, he thought it like the notion of masculine protest is from Adler is that men are reluctant to be put in the feminine position because it's a
mm,
powerless position. But Freud just doesn't think that power is determinative in our psychic uh, relations, which I think is one reason for his relative lack of popularity today, because I think popularity really is, popularity. I think power is so dominant in the way that we culturally, even not just in the academy, but also in in popular society, think about relations. And so
yes.
that's my theory is
Okay.
that everybody that he breaks from has gone over to the side of thinking about the psyche in terms of power, and that's what he can't. He thinks you've taken that position, you're off. You're not in the psychoanalytic camp anymore. And
Mm,
I think that's right, really. And I think today the main split would be between Foucault and Lacan, right? And just
sure.
in our contemporary universe, Foucault would be the thinker of power, and then Lacan the thinker of libido. Or yeah, so
Absolutely.
that's what I would say. Yeah,
Okay, wonderful. Okay, well,
yeah,
so to jump in your chapter, in a lot of
yeah,
ways, you're trying to develop, I guess, your vision of a psychoanalytic existentialism.
yeah,
Is that
yeah.
fair to
So this is
say?
yeah, no, it's totally fair to say this is my. I would say it's my lifelong project. It's what like it's the project I'm most committed to,
Well,
and
dude,
because I go ahead,
no,
go
no,
ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. It's the kind, I haven't read everything you've written, but for some reason, it just hit me a special kind of way, and it's maybe my favorite thing that you've written so far. And maybe it's because I have this hope from a previous episode of Why Theory that I think you said you're going to write a whole book on it. Maybe I don't know if that's still happening, but
No, it's absolutely happening.
yay!
Unless I die first. I mean, it's
Don't
gonna.
do that, please.
Yeah. No, but it's a longer term project. It's not going to be as long as being in nothingness, but
Okay.
it'll be pretty long, and it'll just be an attempt to think through how just to, I think in basic terms, how freedom is tied not to consciousness, but to the unconscious. And so it's not that we have free will, but it's that we have freedom on the level of the unconscious. And I think that obviously existentialism doesn't have, and also it would, that implicit in that is a move, and I talk about this in the essay,
Yeah.
is a move that the fundamental problematic for us as subjects is not the problem of our finitude, but our infinitude, the way that we don't fit into our context, not the way that we're the prisoner of our context or our temporality. So that's what I would try to work out in that. I
Amazing.
probably have, I don't know, probably have like 200 pages of it written, something
Okay.
like that.
Do,
So
do you have any idea? Would it be like double that? Would it fit?
probably, yeah,
Okay.
something
Okay.
like
Something
400
like that.
pages.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Too long, in other words. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, one thing that kind of paused me in my tracks, and I was like, "How do I agree with this?" But then, as I really thought about it, I think I really do. At one point in the chapter, you say that death wasn't as central to Freud as maybe we imagine as a concept, right? And you end up then talking about his understanding of castration. So could you
Yeah.
go there for a second and explain why you think death wasn't as central as this concept of castration?
Yeah, I'll just say what Freud said. So Freud said that we have no, that no one, whether right or wrong. I mean, he maybe he's wrong because I think that there's a pretty good argument that death is has a central role for a lot of people,
Sure.
for me even.
Yeah, yeah, me too.
Yeah, but he thought we have no. The thing is that we have no experience of death, right? So there's no. So it's not like a thing that we can look back to and have fear about. So what we think of as fear of death is just a response to its castration anxieties, because that is an experience, that not an experience, but that's a structuring moment of our psyche. So he thought that has to be that every fear of death is really just a return to this response to castration. Again, yeah, I don't know what I think of that. Like, that's what he thought, but I think my I think you can be afraid of things you haven't experienced, but I don't know that
I was
Freud.
trying to wrestle with that. Like,
Yeah,
what do I think
yeah,
about that?
yeah. I'm not sure I agree with Freud about that, but that is his
Okay.
position for sure.
Sure. Well,
Yeah,
and I think not that you need to speak so much on this, but I think part of why I paused too was I have been influenced by Ernest Becker and the denial of death, who I think had some issues with
yeah,
Freud. And so even in my own way of doing therapy, I kind of help people process like that existential kind of fear of death. But then again, I like the way you talk about castration. So maybe you could go there for a second. We don't mean literally chopping the dick off.
no, no, no. Right, right. I mean, this is a point that I think Lacan makes really well: is that castration isn't just a male or a female issue. It's a symbolic lack that we have as speaking beings, and that's what Freud, if he doesn't know he means that, that's what he means. Uh, and so that fundamental experience of lack or of a cut, that is that that's the way in which we experience anxiety about our death. So that's Freud's idea, and I think it's pretty. I don't. I don't think it necessarily means that there's not a fear of death. It just means that you have to understand the psychic, why that resonates so much for us psychically, is that it's a return. It's this. It's what I like about the idea of thinking about death anxiety in terms of castration anxiety is that it makes it so it's a constant thing, right? It's not something that you've you have an experience of and then overcome, instead of this thing that constantly accompanies you. And I think Freud is really good about that and is helpful.
Sure. And maybe we talked about this before. You've brought this up in different books. Is it ultimately this idea that we can't ultimately have a type of wholeness?
Right. Right. So the question is death the experience of that non, or the prospect of that absence of wholeness being concretized?
Yeah.
And I think that's what Freud thinks. But right, that's what castration is. Castration is the way in which we're constituted by our lack of wholeness and our strive. And I think it's even more than that, because what it means is it's our striving is not even the striving for wholeness. And I think that's a really, to come back to where he departs from figures like Jung. I think for people like Jung and his type, that idea of our desire or striving is a striving for wholeness. And Freud doesn't think it's not that, oh, we're lacking and then we're trying to move toward wholeness. No, we're lacking, and our desire actually is a way of trying to sustain ourselves as lacking, not trying to overcome it. And I think that's, to me, one of the great insights by Freud. And the problem with when you translate that to death, I think it becomes this notion that it's this this barrier that I'm trying to find a way to overcome. And I think Freud thinks, no, castration is it's a barrier that's constitutive of me. And I can't, to try to overcome it would not make any sense. And so that's why it's important to integrate rather than to try to overcome or try to find a way to get around or something, or to become whole, right? Like that's not the desire. That's not, you might consciously desire that. You might consciously say, I want to find or consciously want to find a utopia or whatever.
I think you see that everywhere.
All the time, right? Like, I mean, it's the capitalist way, right? You're looking for a commodity that will make you whole, or a partner or something, or a social formation. I think that a lot of people believe in whatever, communism, anarchism, and not everybody, but a lot of people think that there'll be wholeness associated with these things. And I think that's what's great about Freud, is that he thinks, no, that lack of wholeness, which is what he calls castration, is the basic structure that we can't ever escape or get around.
Sure. That's great. Now, Todd, I think one of the ways, and I know we've talked about this before, that you kind of problematize Freud is where he might say the unconscious is the site of unfreedom. You're arguing that it's actually the opposite. It has a potential for being a site of freedom.
Yeah, that's in this essay, I think, and I've talked about it in other places, but for sure, that is definitely true about Freud. So he thought that the unconscious is governed by necessity. That's what he thought. And I think, no, that it's because I think it's through, in a way, it doesn't make sense, right? Because you think, oh, my freedom has to be the way I consciously decide on something. How can that not be it? But I think what's compelling to me about the notion of the unconscious as a site of freedom is that part of it is a theory of desire that Jacques Lacan lays out, that so society makes a certain demand on us, right? Whatever it is, like you should buy a lot of things and be happy, whatever it is, right?
Sure.
I don't know what the demand
What a terrible thing.
Whatever. It doesn't matter. Or you should obey, whatever the demand is, sure. Right? And buying a lot of things and being happy is obeying. But and then our unconscious desire is how we interpret that demand. So the demand is never made. It's always made in words and in a conscious form, but there's always whenever you say something to someone, or the society says something, there's always beneath it, there's something else that's being meant, and you don't know what that is. So how you interpret that unconsciously, in terms of the way you start to structure your desire, that's how you define yourself. So that's why I think that's why I associate the unconscious with freedom, because it's the singular way you respond to this generalized demand. And it could even not even be generalized. It could be a demand that's first from your parents, and it could be a demand, again, think about all the different ways people respond to the same situation. So I was reading this book by this guy, Robert Sapolsky. Do you know who this is?
Oh, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. It's total determinist guy, right?
Were you reading the one on determinism, his latest?
Yeah, it's called, I think it's called Determined.
Determined, sure.
Yeah. And it's interesting and good even. But there's a couple questions I would have, which is, first of all, why are you writing this book? But,
yes.
and then why are you telling us that we need to change the way we treat people that are guilty of things? Because how are we able to change the way? Why are we free on the second level but not free on the first? So that there's a whole meta language problem, I think. So those are basic issues. But I thought it was really interesting because the whole thing is about free will, and so I just wanted to say, well, what about the unconscious? Because for me, I don't believe in free will either, but I believe in a free unconscious. And I think he has all these predictive models, right? Like if your brain is a certain thing and you've grew up in a certain environment, then this is why you're gonna be a criminal or whatever. And I just would say, well, no, because and this is the problem. He can't, and he even says, I have a little problem with predictability. I can always analyze after the fact, and I feel like saying, well, there's the whole ball game, right? Like
Just stop writing.
If you can't say ahead of time, then you're not really showing the way the person's determined.
Right.
Anybody can go after the fact and say, oh, X, Y, Z is why this thing happened, right? So what I think is interesting is, and he, of course, doesn't address it because of this entire point is that he doesn't want to address this, is that there always is a way in which the same determinations can work on two different people and they can respond in absolutely different ways.
Sure.
Right. You know, and how they respond is their singularity, is their freedom. And I think my sense is if you take that away, then you do first of all, you deprive people of their singularity, but also you deprive us of what makes our existence interesting and worth living. So, but I think that I grew up on Jean-Paul Sartre and I love existentialism, and Simone de Beauvoir, but I think that for both of them, the unconscious plays absolutely. They think if you admit the unconscious, you've given up the ghost on freedom, right? So you've sacrificed freedom, and so I think that's the great mistake of 20th century existentialism, and so that's what I'm trying to correct, starting here, but then developing in some other things.
Now, I don't know. So would they even use the term? Because I'm thinking of like Eric Fromm, his understanding of the unconscious is those things that you're just not quite yet aware of.
Right.
Which
well,
is
that's not unconscious.
Freud,
no,
right.
It's right. It's absolutely not that. Right. And I think that's so often, it's interesting how contemporary neuroscience certainly has a notion of unconscious, but it's basically our neurological processes that we don't know, that's not the Freudian unconscious.
To me, that's like
the
subconscious or subconscious processes.
Right, or something, or I think it's interesting because, or consciousless, right? They're consciousless.
Okay. Yeah,
So
Freud,
I like that. It's really interesting. So German has basically two ways to negate something. Our way, which is un.
Sure.
And the more common way is los. Like if something is free, it's kostenlos, doesn't have a cost, right? And so the most common way to talk about the unconscious prior to Freud was, so consciousness is Bewusstsein, and to say something conscious is bewusst. And the most common thing to say was bewusstlos, without consciousness. And so Freud didn't invent the term unbewusst, but he always used it. So he never just said it's without consciousness. He said it's unconscious. And I think he did that because he understood that the unconscious is an agency that has its own logic that isn't reducible to the logic of, it's not just without consciousness. It's instead, it has its own logic and it operates according to its own structure. And it can't be translated into the terms of consciousness. So that's why I think, again, that's another reason why I think it's the site of freedom, because it has this, I think about the ways you can be consciously programmed, right? Like consciousness can just follow a certain, and I think if we're just beings of consciousness, maybe Sapolsky's right. Maybe we are just determined, but I think it's precisely because we have these two competing logics in our thinking that's what breaks us from just being purely determined beings, that I think you can't think of. And I think it's interesting, like, why isn't AI free? Well, because it doesn't have they can't program in an unconscious, right?
Yes.
They can't.
I love that.
I know, but isn't it what's interesting though that our filmic depiction of it, the great one, probably from Blade Runner, they do have an unconscious. They're more, the replicants are more subjects than, I don't know, is Deckard a human? That's a whole question.
Yeah.
But they're more subjects than the seeming human figures in the film, and how in 2001, some people say he's the most human character Kubrick ever created.
Wow.
Right. And so I think it's similar. It's so there have been these representations, I think, of AI that show it as having an unconscious, but I think in all of its forms that we see today, it still doesn't have that, because how do you program in an unconscious? I just don't know that you can do that.
I don't think you can. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I also
And
love.
that's the creative source, right? Like that's
Sure.
why it can't be creative too.
Sure, absolutely. I love too how you describe that one of the ways we see this is how we can never obey perfectly.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
that's
Right.
just great. You know, I don't. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not like a moral weakness. It's a dimension of the unconscious aspect of our being.
Right, because we're always at some level disobeying, right? We're
Right.
not doing it exactly like we're supposed. And I think, isn't the speed limit the great example of this? Like you never, and we get pissed at someone who's trying to perfectly obey the speed limit. But I think it's
Absolutely.
everything. It's everything. Even if we say, like most of us obey the law not to kill other people, right? But do we obey it perfectly? No, because we all have these little fantasies like and even sometimes people that don't even deserve it, like person that just cuts us off in traffic, we just want to see them killed, or somebody that, hits a basket for another team against which we're rooting. So
Right,
I
right.
think that, yeah, with the people we want to, so everything, I think, obviously fantasies about infidelity, fantasies about just everything, right? And I
course.
think we're constantly disobeying, we're not obeying in a perfect way.
Yeah,
I think, yeah,
absolutely.
precisely because of the unconscious. Yeah,
Man, I love. Maybe you could kind of elaborate on this statement in your chapter. You talk about the psychoanalytic cure being at some level maybe taking responsibility for the unconscious.
yeah,
And I wonder
yeah.
if you could kind of speak to that, what you meant by that.
Well, so when you're confronted by your unconscious, what you've done unconsciously, you always feel like it has acted. So
Sure.
Freud's term, so he uses the term das in German, das Es, to describe what we call the id, but das Es in German is the it. So it's an interesting, maybe unfortunate translation, because I think when you're confronted with the unconscious, like you're confronted with the id doing something, it's as if it did something, I didn't do it, right?
Yeah, right.
And I think with a slip, you really feel that way. When you make an unconscious, what people call Freudian slip, you don't feel like I'm not responsible for that. I didn't mean that. But the whole point is to take responsibility for it means that even the things you didn't mean, you have to say, well, that actually captures something not just true about me, but maybe most true about me. Right.
And
so
that is your example in the book or in the chapter of someone saying their ex-partner's name to their current wife or spouse was great.
Yeah.
That was so difficult. Who hasn't experienced that?
It was a personal example for me. Hopefully I didn't use the person's name, but
No, thank God.
No, but I know, but it happened. I think, did I say this, that it happened repeatedly? And I remember the last time it happened, I was in my parents' kitchen and she was in the living room, and I said, and then I said, I knew, and I was hoping she didn't quite hear it because I had done it repeatedly that day. And she did hear it, and she got very angry, this person. And she said, "You don't really love me, you really love her," which was true. So that's kind of terrible. And then, so it did reveal a total truth. And then I decided my way of dealing with it, I don't know if I say this in the chapter, was I would call her honey or dear. So I would resort to these stupid, which I ordinarily hate, these stupid nicknames, but I just had to do it
to play it safe.
I couldn't help myself. So yeah, I think that's a case where you have to taking responsibility means, okay, where's my real desire lie, right? It doesn't lie with this person I'm with, but with this other person that I'm no longer with.
Sure. So, what would your psychoanalytic existentialism say to, Sartre's comment that we are condemned to freedom? I think you have a bit of a spin on it. That's really good.
Yeah, that I think that, what do I say? I can't remember.
I think you say that Sartre would say that we are sort of, I guess, like born in this position, and we have to come to terms with the fact that we're not tied to this authority. But and this is one thing I wanted to get into. Your whole point is you actually have to first, as a subject, go through the social authority, come to terms with the fact that it's not this substantial thing, and then that through the unconscious becomes this site of freedom.
Yeah, I think that's right. So a couple things. This is what I was hoping that I said that that freedom isn't a given a priori. So we're not condemned to it. Instead, it emerges through this relationship to whatever authority figures, parental, whatever kind of social authority figure. So that's the first thing. And I think, and then it is constituted through how we relate to that authority. And I think what's really interesting to me is that I think I'm picking on Sartre too much because I really love him, but I think another failure of that, of being in nothingness, is that he doesn't really he thinks of our relations as always dyadic. So I relate to you right now, and there's some kind of constant struggle taking place, right? And I'm trying to put you into the position of an object, but then that's unsatisfying to me. So he gets this problem of the dyadic relation, but what he doesn't really have any sense of is the role of the third party, the role of some mediating, what Jacques Lacan calls the big other, but some kind of social authority that through which we have to talk in order to, that sets up the rules for our engagement, that provides recognition for each of us and what we're saying, and gives value to certain ideas and concepts that we have. And so he thinks of freedom as it's just given. And he doesn't see how it's formed through that. And I think it's, again, tied to, this is because it's not unconscious for him, that it's tied to this unconscious relation that we have to this third party that always exists between us, and that we can't, it's tied to that idea when I said that we can't just purely obey. So we can't just purely obey that third party. So we out of that, that's how our freedom gets asserted, because through that, all the ways in which we don't just obey perfectly.
Sure.
Right? So it's not like freedom is avoidable. So I don't think he's wrong in that way. I just think he thinks of it too. He doesn't see how it emerges, right? Because he just thinks it's a given. It's an ontological given for us. And I don't think it's that. I think it's constituted through this third party.
Sure. Okay. Now, what can you speak to how you maybe rethink that fundamental existentialist maxim that existence precedes essence?
Yeah.
And I'll just say this, however this lands, in the world of psychotherapy I'm in, there actually is a strand called existentialist humanist psychotherapy. And I mean, Sartre would be kind of maybe one of the figures, whether they understand.
But wouldn't it be Viktor Frankl as the main guy? Is that right?
Yeah. So Viktor Frankl is definitely one. Sartre gets brought up, but the way that existence precedes essence gets understood is kind of more in like a social constructionist kind of way. There's no human nature, there's no essence. And so that's not really what you're describing at all.
No, and that's not what he thinks either.
And that's not really what he thinks, right?
Yeah, not really at all. No, I mean, his point is just that he has this famous line, to do is to be, right? Like that it's what we are is constituted by what we do. And that's his basic idea. And that's what he means when he says existence precedes essence, that we we constitute our essence through all the things that we do. So it's not like we're born someone and then how we act follows from that. Instead, and he thinks this is aligned with our freedom, that we all the different choices that we make during the course of our existence, that's what makes up our essence. And it's only when we die that our essence gets completely fixed, he thinks. Now, my take is a little different because
Yes.
I think that certainly in some way he's right, but I think this is tied to what I said about this earlier point about the social authority, because I don't think he recognizes I'm a little uncomfortable criticizing Sartre because I think he's so great, but I don't think he recognizes the extent to which we are given an essence, right? We're given an essence that we then struggle with. And that essence comes from we're constantly being told what we are. We're constantly being constituted socially in different ways, biologically in different, whatever. And then we react to that. We react to, so I think I would say essence precedes existence, but then existence is the way that we are constantly screwing up our essence. We're constantly distorting it, making it different, undermining it. So that's how I would tweak his statements. I don't totally disagree with it, but I think it misses this. See, I think it's actually anti-social constructionist. So it's funny to me that he gets interpreted and that line gets interpreted in that way, because I think the social constructionist believes that the essence is constituted by the society, and then how we exist just follows from that essence, right? I think that's an ABC of social constructionism.
Sure.
Right? That you get your essence from the social, it constructs you, and then all your various existential goings and comings are just a result of that essence that's been created. That's why you never, the social constructionist isn't so concerned with how you break out of your constructed position, because they don't really think you can, because they think that's just the position you're in, and you have to learn to be tolerant of other positions, or I don't know, whatever you think. But yeah, I think that it seems like they're very anti-existential. I've always thought that they're very anti-existentialists. They might think that they're not, but I think they definitely are.
Yeah, and then I just love how in your way of thinking about existence preceding essence, that it really is what we do, our acts kind of unveil or reveal like that unconscious element.
Yeah, I think that's really true. And I've gotten that. That's, even though Hegel's a
I was going to say, did you get it from Hegel?
Yeah, for sure. So it's interesting, right? Because he's a pre-psychoanalytic thinker.
Sure.
He has no idea he doesn't even use the word unconscious ever. Ironically, his one time very close friend Schelling does use the term unconscious in a way not far from Freud. So that is interesting, but much more than Schelling. Hegel's the thinker who thinks our acts reveal us. They reveal what we can't know about ourselves, right? He thinks that so all of his philosophy is going through different positions and saying, okay, this position says this. Like, let's take Stoicism, for instance, right?
Sure.
Stoicism says, I retreat from the world. I retreat into my own private Idaho, and I stay there. I don't care about the world. And then Hegel's like, okay, that's what the Stoic says. Let's look at what they do, right? This is his point, where does all the content that the Stoic is inwardly retreated into come from? Well, it comes from the outside world that they have retreated from. So they're really dependent upon this thing that they claim they're totally distanced from. So he sees the way in which so this would be the contradiction of Stoicism for him.
Sure.
But his point is, if you play out how Stoicism acts and what it does, it betrays its truth, that it's hidden in what it claims about itself.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's, I definitely, and that's where I think the existence, if you think about existence preceding essence in that, or existence revealing essence in that
Yeah.
way, I think it's very, very powerful and incredible, really. So I think, yeah, I mean, Hegel's incredibly hard to read, but I think it's such a valuable exercise because I think so many times, you hear people say, if people tell you what they are, you should believe them. And I think you hear this all the time. People say it about Trump. They said it about everyone. And I always say, well, okay, in a way, but not really,
No.
because you have to see they don't know what they are, right? And that is Hegel's entire point. So instead, see the way in which what they say plays itself out, and then you'll see what they are. Then you'll see the unconscious revealed. Because I think when you say people tell you what they are, that doesn't give them an unconscious.
No, it doesn't.
I mean, they tell you what you are between the lines, right? But not directly. And I think that's the crucial thing.
Yeah, no, without revealing too much, I just had a brand new client yesterday that came in a bit of an emergency situation, but he said, my whole life I've just never been anxious and I don't know what is going on. And as he was describing his life, I mean, I was just thinking, dude, this is so much anxiety. Like, I'm not going to believe the words that you're telling me, of course.
Right. I mean, right. You'd be a terrible therapist if you believed what the patient said, right? Because they don't know. That's why they're coming to you, so that they can talk.
Isn't that the talking cure? And at some level, it's a space where some of that gets revealed to the person.
Right, you reveal what you don't know about yourself, right? Because you're just talking, and you don't. I mean, that's why Freud, of course, has the one rule of psychoanalysis that you can't censor. But
the free association,
it almost doesn't matter. It almost doesn't matter. You can try to censor. And even the way that you censor will be.
I think there's gold. There's gold in the way the person tries to censor themselves.
I know. Yeah. I know. And then especially if the person is aware of it afterwards. So I was in psychoanalysis, and one thing that I just know I know I violated the rule because I have the guy's like, well, what's the basic fantasy? Can you articulate it? It was too embarrassing. I just couldn't do it. And so I just said, I kind of lied. And then I realized, okay, then I even though I didn't say it, I kind of got to through the way of avoiding it, I kind of revealed to myself at least what the key thing was. But yeah, I think so. So I don't think even the fundamental rule, I'm not sure how important it is, because I think you reveal even when you try not to reveal.
Yeah. Yeah. Well said. Okay, so Todd, I know you didn't get into statement that hell is other people. I wondered if you could maybe speak to what he meant by that, and then would your version of psychoanalytic existentialism see it in any different kind of way? Would you add your kind of spin to it?
Yeah, that's a great question. So this comes from the play Huis Clos, No Exit by Sartre, and toward the end of the play. Yeah. So first of all, what Sartre means by it, he means that the problem, and this gets back to this notion of a dyadic relationship that we have to others. So that when I have to encounter someone else like you, your wishes, whatever, are always imposing themselves on me, and you're constantly, just to use Sartre's jargon, you're constantly turning me into an in itself, right? You're freezing my freedom. Like I'm constantly made into, just in a non-jargony way, you're making me into an object, right? And I'm frozen. Whereas what I want to do is act freely as what he called a for itself, and constantly think about the world, change it, negate. For him, this is, I think, a great part of his thinking. For him, thinking about something and acting is an act of negating. So all thinking, all acting is negating. And that's freedom. That ability to, this, whatever, if I look at this tree outside, if I look at you, I'm negating you, right? I'm not allowing you to just stay as you are in itself, right? And so that's why hell is other people, because the other people are constantly detracting from my ability to just be a figure of pure negating and making me this frozen positivity. And that's for Sartre always to be looked at as always, there's always something horrific about, I mean, and I think
Is that
most of
Freud
us,
and Civilization and His Discontents?
yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of resonances with that. And I think most of us can just experientially really identify with
Totally.
that.
If I'm really honest, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, everybody, I think, even the most vain of us, I think, hate being looked at on some really
Sure. Sure.
fundamental level. And I think Sartre really gets that. But I think here's the problem that I would have with that. First of all, and I think this is just again a limitation of his thinking. He doesn't see how the relations with others are actually constitutive of my subjectivity, and most importantly, that social authority other is necessary for me to even attain the freedom that he wants to grant me. So, excuse me. I'm not just initially this free, totally negating for itself. Instead, I become free through this initial subjection to the other, the social authority, right? So I think, yeah, and then I think the relationship to others isn't. I don't think we are. I don't think we feel like, oh, I'm even having, like we were just talking about, that under the look of the other. Oh, I feel turned to an object. Okay, yeah, but I also, in the relation to other, there's also this fundamental unknowing, not an unknowing of the desire of the other. And I think, so it's not, it's
dusting.
never just, yeah, right. It's exactly. So it's never just our friend Rick Boothby. That's one of his favorite ideas. So it's never just that other wants to turn me into an object. It's always, I don't know exactly. And this is why I think the other feels dangerous, because we don't know what the other wants from us. And so I think that,
but isn't that at some level also kind of exciting, or it could,
right,
be
right.
part of like the eroticism and the
yeah.
wooing
So
somewhat?
Yeah, for sure. I was going to say that, yeah, hell is other people, but it's also heaven is other people, right? So that's what you're getting at,
Yeah,
right? Like
yeah.
there's an eroticism about that, as well as a horrific quality to it.
Sure.
So I think that's, I mean, isn't that, do you know this film, The Night Porter?
No, I
don't recommend it necessarily. I don't recommend it, but it's interesting because it's about a woman who was in a death camp, and she later has an affair with a guy who was a guard at the camp. This is after the war, right? And what's interesting is the way that it combines those two things we're talking about the relation to the other, right? On the one hand, he was a killer, incredibly dangerous to her.
Sure.
But on the other hand, he functions. The film is very controversial, as you could imagine, because it eroticized that figure for her. And I think that was the thing that was really people didn't like. I think people like their films about Nazis to be very clear cut. they're just the villain, right? Yeah. Anyway, so I think that's what I would say about that. That yeah, hell is other people, but then heaven is other people too.
Okay, so it's kind of both.
It has to be both, just like you're saying about this eroticism of the other. That I think Sartre doesn't really. So even his conception, so that he has long sections on masochism and sadism. In Being a Nothingness, and if you read them after knowing psychoanalysis, you just say to yourself, what is he talking about? Because they're very unsexual, which is odd because of course there's sexual perversions, right? I don't mean perversion in a judgment sense. Just Freud called them perversions. And the whole point is that they're ways of finding sexual arousal, right? They're not about, but for Sartre, they're just about a pure power relation, right? They're not like the sexual dimension is lost on him. So, and he even kind of views sex in that way, right? Like sex is really basically conquest, And it's a very, I hate when people say this, but it's a very male way of thinking
Okay.
about
Okay.
sex. I
Yeah.
think it's kind of traditional, right? But it all fits with the same thing because, right, when you take someone as a sexual object, you reduce them to being an object for him. And that's part of this hell is other people thing. Like, have you been conquered by this other person?
Sure.
And I don't know, sex is, I think for psychoanalysis is more than that, right? It's also the way in which it takes us out of ourselves and allows us to assert some kind of freedom, not just we're not just turned into an object. So that's
It's a side of freedom too. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely, right, yeah, for sure. So that's again, I think a limitation of his perspective.
Okay.
But,
Okay. So let me ask you maybe one kind of other like big question.
Sure.
So I know that after like Sartre and the other existentialists, there were some Christians who developed like a Christian existentialism. And so my question to you is, would there be a place, whether it's Christianity or any other religion, for someone to take your psychoanalytic existentialism and maybe tether it to some kind of Christianity? Or do you have any thoughts on all that?
Yeah. So first of all, it's a Christian who invented existentialism, right? It's Soren
Kierkegaard. Yeah, totally.
Yeah. So it was secularized, not Christianized. I know that there are later like Gabriel Marcel, whatever.
Sure.
But I think it has to be first thought of as a Christian
Okay.
doctrine.
That's a good point.
So there's that. But I think, because I mean, we've talked before, I have a very Hegelianized understanding of Christianity. And I think that it fits in with this idea of psychoanalytic existentialism, because the notion would be that there's unknowing, Rick Boothby and I talk about this all the time, the unknowing God, right? Like this God, that like there's this absence within the figure of God. And I think that really, to me, fits in with this, that in a way, you have to conceive of God like that if you're going to invest yourself in this psychoanalytic existentialism, because otherwise then the problem is that you make the other into an omnipotent authority, right? Like, so again, I don't mean to pick on him, but just to return to Sapolsky, like he's a total,
Sure.
in some sense, he's a total atheist, right? He doesn't believe in God.
Right.
In the traditional sense. But I would just say he believes in God a hell of a lot more than almost anybody I know.
Wow.
Because he erects like that. He
Great
erects
word. Just erects.
No, but it's right. It's the proper word. In both senses. Like, he erects this figure of completely substantial authority, who's both like culture and nature and can always be relied on, right? And the whole point of freedom is you can't rely on that authority. And I think the Hegelian notion of the unknowing or the lacking God, so he thinks, just to summarize for people that don't have the time to read Hegel, but his notion is that he thinks Christianity is the privileged religion because it brings God back down from the beyond and puts God in the most humiliated position, dying on the cross. And that absolute humiliation of the figure of the absolute shows that even the greatest authority is lacking. And that's how, for Hegel, that's what's the incredible insight of Christianity. And that's what's missing in, I think, a lot of other seemingly atheist positions and this is why I think it's important to insist upon some kind of religious thing that has God as a figure of lack or as a figure of contradiction, incompleteness, right? That otherwise you end up creating some ersatz authority that then really is functioning more like this complete figure of God than the old God of the Old Testament, right?
Sure.
Or of the Hebrew scriptures. So I think that's I mean, the long and the short of it, the answer to your question is it's absolutely what I think is compatible with that. And I'll probably, when I'm writing this thing, I'll probably talk about God
Okay.
for some good part of it,
That would be
because I think
great.
that, yeah, I think it's really important. And I also think we live in a time where the retreat that you see so many religious attempts to constitute an absolute authority that's not lacking, right?
Totally.
Like,
Totally. I
I
was just
think
thinking of
that's,
Trump and I mean, whoever.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, it's right, right. So many, it's,
JD
and they're
Vance, I guess. Yeah.
right, right, and right, and right, and they're totally invested in this. How can we have a substantial authority that brooks no lack, right? And that's, I think that's the thing that I don't think we should cede the ground of religion to that position.
Okay.
That's what I don't think.
Sure.
Yeah. I
Sure.
think because I think Hegel thought this, and I wonder what you think of it. He thought the garden variety person, the everyday person, doesn't have time or inclination or has better things to do than to read philosophy.
Absolutely.
Right? So his idea is when they go to church or when they are engaged in belief, that's their version of philosophical activity. So he thought theology and philosophy have exactly the same subject matter. And I think most philosophers don't think that. I mean, Freud was a vehement atheist,
Totally.
right? Just absolutely against, he thought the religions of humanity should be classified among the mass delusions, right? It's just
Right,
has
right.
no sympathy. That's from Civilization's Discontents. No sympathy. But I'm more on Hegel's side. On this.
I'm with you. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I think so I feel like that's a thing. So I don't think in other words, I just don't think it's a ground that should be ceded to this moronic fundamentalism, which is not, I mean, America doesn't have a monopoly on it.
No.
It's rampant. I mean, that's what we're seeing in Israel. That's what we're seeing in Iran. That's what we're seeing in Russia.
Yes.
We're seeing around the world, right? It's everywhere. So.
Absolutely. Like in my field where I see this like draw to that authority and the substance is, it's weird to say, but like neuroscience and even just the body is almost just being flawless or
I know. It's kind of,
I don't know if Sapolsky gets into some of that, but it's so frustrating.
Well, no, he does. Yeah. It's so frustrating. I know. And what's interesting is how I was just talking to my podcast partner, Ryan Engley, about this,
Sure.
that within even neuroscience, there's this incredible replication crisis, right? They can't they can't replicate studies and get the same results. So it's funny because there's a whole crisis at work in those disciplines, and yet there's still this belief in the absolute substantiality of the claims, which I think, don't you think it's true that the more a thing is in crisis, oftentimes the more there's a substantializing of the claims to try to fend off the crisis, right? And I think
for sure.
I think that's probably what. So our dean I love him. So this is not a critique of him, but
Sure.
He was introducing me once I was giving a talk on Citizen Kane and Donald Trump, which is, by the way, that's Donald Trump's favorite movie. So he does have some good qualities. His interpretation of it is kind of crazy, though.
Okay.
He thinks that Kane is saying the problem is with Kane is he never found the right woman. So it's an interesting take.
That says a lot about his psyche, I'm sure.
It does. It really does. But I did a whole thing on psychoanalysis and Kane and Trump.
Very cool.
And the dean, after he introduced, was very nice. And afterward, he just says to me privately, so he's a psychologist. And he studies rats and
Sure.
they kill rats and whatever. And he says to me, it's interesting that you're able to take this thing that has no scientific value whatsoever and are able to come up with some good insights from it. And so he thought he was complimenting me. He really thought he was giving, but he was, of course, he was giving me a terrible insult.
Sure.
Right. But I thought, well, that's fair enough. I mean, I think that's a pretty good articulation of the the doxa, right? About psychoanalysis.
Sure.
So yeah, and I think it's because there's such a substantialization of the authority, like you said, of the body or of this neuroscientific conception of the brain, right?
Right, right.
Yeah. So I think it's fascinating. And I was in a defense. A guy he's in psychology again, in a thesis defense, and the kid brought up Lacan, like his part of it was on Lacan, and the guy didn't even his thesis director had no idea who that even was.
Wow.
And he just was like kind of mystified, like, why is this appealing at all to you? And how can it relate? And what's interesting is there's no conceptual space at all for that kind of, for a psychoanalytic take on things, right? Because and I think, again, it comes back to what you're saying, because the authority is so substantialized.
Yes.
Right. Yeah.
Absolutely.
But I mean, I think they do good work. It's just,
sure.
it's just, do you think I mean, it seems like the whole basis of science has to be that there is no substantial authority, right? And if you invest in a substantial authority, then you've missed what is essential to the scientific experiment. But yeah. So
that's such a good point, man. I need to sit with that. That's so good. I couldn't agree more.
I mean, isn't that what's so great about, and why people are so fascinated, I mean, oftentimes in the wrong ways, but with quantum mechanics, because
there's such an obsession with that. Sure.
I know. And I think it's very fetishized, but I think it's certainly true that, I mean, I think people try to erect it as some kind of an authority, some kind of mysterious authority because it's the source of mystery, when it's not really. But I do think it does call into question this fundamentally deterministic universe. And I think that to me is an incredical, so that's an area where, it's interesting because quantum mechanicists today, they don't really know. They have all these equations that work,
sure,
right? But they don't know why. They don't have a unified theory. So it's not like our knowledge of it hasn't progressed theoretically that much since whatever, Bohr and Heisenberg. So it's I find that it's just a fascinating thing. And it kind of cuts against what we were talking about in neuroscience. There's a real divide, I think, between the biological sciences and the physical sciences.
Oh, sure.
On this question, right? About the substantialization of the authority. I don't know.
I think I know what your answer being. It's my perspective too. And we're not saying that psychoanalysis is now the substantialized authority in the sense that it actually tells us that there is no such thing.
Right. So it can't function that way,
right?
Because it's constantly putting into question. Lacan has this great line where he says, psychoanalysis is like a religion, but then he says, and it's a fascinating line. He says, but unlike a religion, it has nothing to forget.
Oh, that's great.
And I always thought, wow, and I think what he means is it doesn't have to forget its origin, this mythological origin, and repress that, because it doesn't have this authority at the beginning, right?
Oh,
the whole
amazing.
Beginning is the calling into question of the substantial authority. And that comes back to this idea that you have to take responsibility. And that's tied to the idea of freedom, right? Just to come back to where we started, that you have to take responsibility. You can't shove off the responsibility onto some kind of other authority figure. Instead, you have to take responsibility for your own unconscious act.
Oh, I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredible, Todd.
Yeah.
Well, man, this has been great. Is there anything else about the chapter that you could highlight? I think we've covered most of it.
Yeah, I think we covered most of it. I think you had great questions. It was just so fun talking to you.
Yeah, it's always great. And I know it won't be the last time, man. So thank you again.
Hopefully not. Yeah. Okay. Take care, man.
Okay.
I'll see
bye.
you. Okay. All right. See you.